stage.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to start things off. It's the first conference I've ever participated in electronically, but and I'm speaking from my little studio here in Vancouver, and good to be here, or maybe I'm there. I'm not sure. What draws me to this gathering is my close alignment with what I see as its top priority: to address the critical dilemma we're facing as individuals, as members of society, and as dwellers on this planet. I appreciate that this is not a narrowly focused academic meeting devoted to some esoteric topic, but that we're paying attention to the elephant in everyone's room. The clock is ticking. According to the latest setting of the so-called doomsday clock, we're just a few minutes to midnight. This figurative clock, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists since 1947, symbolically indicates our closeness to a global catastrophe precipitated by human-made nuclear and environmental crises. Science's latest reports on climate change are especially ominous. Unbelievable as it may sound, within the span of a couple of decades, human civilization may act on a cliff. And I want to add that while the climate crisis may be our most pressing concern, it's generally true that we live in a time of crisis and tumultuous change. Many of the institutions we relied on in the past, marriage, family, church, are presently disintegrating. The ethnic conflicts raging around the world, especially in relation to recent mass migrations, reflect the destabilization of cultural and national identity. World markets have reached new levels of erratic fluctuation. As a consequence of all this, quote, fragmentation is now very widespread, not only throughout society, but also in each individual. That's a quote from the philosopher-physicist David Bohm. I guess we can hope that our long deteriorating situation can somehow be turned around. I've been hoping for that since the early 1970s, and I've devoted much of my life energy to that end. It's true, though, that in the last couple of years, I've started to feel it may no longer be possible to pull ourselves out of the hole we've dug. And yet, instead of curling up into a ball of despair, here I am with you participating at this conference. So obviously I haven't given up. What I'm going to propose in this presentation is that the denial of a primal force of nature lies at the core of our current predicament. Nietzsche gave a vividly dramatic description of this force in portraying his Dionysian world. It is a monster of energy with force throughout. It is a play of forces and waves of forces that is at the same time one and many. It is a sea of forces flowing and rushing together with its play of contradiction. It is a mystery world that is eternally self-creating, eternally self-destroying. Nietzsche was never at a loss for vivid language. Jung spoke correspondingly of, quote, the prima materia, which is the original chaos and the sea. And Gebser, for his part, intimated a primordial state of affairs, an undifferentiated, archaic state, one of utter boundlessness. In my own writing, I've spoken of the Apeiron. That's the focus of my 2004 book, Dimensions of Apeiron. The Greek word pyros means limit or boundary, and apeiron means without boundaries. boundless, or indeterminate, infinite. The Apeiron is variously interpreted as, quote, the unintelligible, the many, the moving, the ugly, the bad, the inchoate flux of opposites or contraries, the principle of disorder or disharmony. The quote is from Peter Angeli's book, The Dictionary of Philosophy. One chilling image of the Apeiron is the Medusa, a face that can't be faced. And I'm going to put up an image now. And let's see if this is going to work. Okay, so where is my image? What are you seeing?
We're still seeing you.
Still seeing me. Okay, let's see if
You need to go down to the bottom and hit share.
Yeah, but I don't see that. Okay. I don't see the share. I saw that the other day, but I'm not seeing it now. Let's see if I can. Wait a second. There we go. Now I see it.
Okay.
And I hope you're not seeing, you may be seeing someone who looks like me, but you're not seeing me at the moment? Or you're still seeing me?
We're still seeing you.
Oh,
there we go.
Okay, that's someone who looks like me. And that's a 4th century classical Greek image of the Medusa. And now and now you should see me again, hopefully. Yeah. Associate the Apeiron with the boundless chaos of primeval nature. The basic premise of my talk is that our current dilemma with aspects can be related at bottom to the repression of the Apeiron. To bring that out, I'll explore the workings of this ancient force and history of Western culture. My hope is that by viewing the present crisis in an historical context, one that calls attention to its elemental source, we can better understand it and hopefully perhaps be able to come to grips with it. Mention of the Apeiron is first heard in what is taken as the oldest fragment of Western philosophical thought, the Anaximander fragment of the 6th century BCE. Here, according to Martin Heidegger's philosophical analysis, Apeiron is portrayed as the boundless giver of boundaries, the boundless giver of boundaries. With this, Anaximander intimates that the world hardly comes ready-made, already parceled out into pre-existent, neatly bounded categories. Instead, we're confronted with the paradox that boundaries arise from a natural world that itself is devoid of boundaries. But, Anaximander notwithstanding, the ancient Greeks generally didn't recognize the paradox that boundaries are given by a boundless source. They believed that they were the ones to forge the boundaries, wresting them from an Apeiron that gave nothing of its own accord and was nothing more than boundless. The Greeks were involved in a struggle for individuality that pitted human reason against the irrational forces of primal nature. In the raw ambiguity of Apeiron, there can be no clear-cut unity, no stable center of identity, no indivisible core of being, no individual. So it seemed to the early Greeks. It was therefore imperative for them to tame Apeiron, given the primary impulse that motivated their action. To paraphrase Protagoras, man must be the measure of all things. What this basically required was the ascendancy of the autonomous individual. Putting it more generally, from the outset, Western culture has been spurred by the drive toward differentiated being or individuality, toward individuation, to use Jung's term. This end essentially meant containing what at first appeared uncontainable, the boundless Apeiron. For over 2,000 years, Western culture did its best to deny Apeiron and cultivate unambiguous boundaries. It's true that, if Heidegger's interpretation of Anaximander was correct, Apeiron is in fact the source of all boundaries. But during the long historical period when boundaries were still being formed, when the distinctions drawn by human consciousness were still somewhat vague and requiring further clarification, it was necessary not only to deny Apeiron as the giver of boundaries, but to repress Apeiron entirely. If a backward glimpse had been allowed, the delicate process of differentiation could have been disrupted, and a regressive lapse into profound confusion could have taken place. So the history of Western culture, from at least the time of Plato to the mid-19th century, is a history of boundary making in denial of the boundless Apeiron. From Plato's dualistic division of being and becoming to Aristotle's dichotomous logic of either or, to the scientific and technological revolutions of the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, Apeiron remained underground as our culture was busily engaged in sharpening its focus on all sorts of boundaries, physical, geographical, mathematical, perceptual, etc. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, a watershed was reached and Apeiron began to resurface. This was evidenced most basically in the breakup of classical space and time. Why space and time? To say that Apeiron is boundless is to say that it is spaceless and timeless. Space is about boundedness, and in forming boundaries, in drawing clear-cut distinctions of any kind, a spatial context is required. Plato knew this and spoke accordingly of the receptacle, an early notion of space. But Plato's spatial container was given to leaks, discontinuities that obstructed the clear-cut formation of boundaries. Not until the post-Renaissance thinking of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton was the concept of space refined to the point where it could be deemed perfectly continuous. And that changed everything. Now nature could be seen as contained within a well-delineated, sharply bounded framework, what Heidegger called the uniform space-time context. It was this objectification of our experience of nature, this bringing of nature into focus as definitively representable in space and measurable by time, that made the whole scientific enterprise possible. From it, there followed the development of modern experimentation, which relies on precise measurements of events occurring in space and time, and new mathematical advances, such as the use of the calculus to analyze space-time motion. And these, in turn, gave rise to technological innovations that transformed our world. Scientific progress continued in this way into the 19th century, reaching an unprecedented level of exactitude. Yet ironically, this refinement of science brought into view certain limitations of it that previously had gone unnoticed. A primary example of this was the work of Michelson and Morley on the physics of light. An accurate method for directly measuring the velocity of light had recently been developed, allowing these researchers to conduct an experiment that in effect would confirm the expectation that light was transmitted through space in a continuous way like any other object. I'm skipping technical details here. To the amazement of the scientific community, the expectation was upset, and this raised fundamental questions about space and time themselves. The banishment of Apeiron had depended on the existence of a uniform space-time context, a continuous medium in which the phenomena of nature could be probed and measured with complete certainty. Now, with the finding that conventional thinking about space and time couldn't even deal with a phenomenon as basic as light, science's sense of certainty was seriously shaken. Only a decade after the Michelson-Morley experiment was conducted, another groundbreaking experiment on the physics of light was upsetting the scientific apple cart and giving evidence of resurgent Apeiron. The physicist Max Planck was investigating black body radiation, the emission of light in a special absorbent medium, a closed cavity that doesn't reflect the energy of light, but that soaks it up and then discharges it internally. Though Planck's method of studying light was very different from that of Michelson and Morley, he was led to the similar conclusion that light is not transmitted through space in a smoothly continuous fashion. Even though light might seem to radiate in a continuous way in the familiar large-scale world, when we look more closely examining the microscopic properties of light, we find that it actually comes in discrete bundles, those famous quanta. So like Michelson and Morley before him, Planck's investigation of light brought him face to face with a fundamental discontinuity in nature that wound up challenging all the old thinking about space and time, which presupposed continuity. The resurfacing of the boundless Apeiron did not obey disciplinary boundaries. In the 1880s, the same decade that the findings of Michelson and Morley were raising doubts about classical space in the field of physics, space was being disrupted in the field of art. A primary example of this was Edouard Manet's renowned work, Bar at the Folies Bergère. And I would like to put up an image of that, if I can possibly do it. So I need to click on share and then put up my image and then raise it so I can get share and then hope that you see Manet's bar. Can you?
All good. Yeah.
All good?
All good.
Okay, so what you see in this image is an image fractured, broken into two perspectives. In the left 2/3, you see a woman tending a bar, and we're viewing her from a frontal perspective. But in the right-hand third of the image, we see a mirror reflection of the woman's back as she's talking to a top-hatted gentleman, but now our perspective is shifted to the left of center. So I'm going to remove this and tell you what art historians Paul Weitz and Arnold Glimcher have to say about this. They take it as an instance of fractured space. Quote, two or more discrete lines of view are present at the same time in a given portrayal of space. These separate but simultaneous views break or fracture what was once seen as homogeneous. Weizenglünscher note that this juxtaposition of opposing perspectives leaves the viewer in an ambiguous state. Beyond the fields of art and physics, I could give other examples of the 19th century fracturing of classical space and reemergence of Apeiron. In dimensions of Apeiron, I work with non-Euclidean geometry, photography, existentialist philosophy, and so on. For present purposes, I want to explore Western culture's response to resurgent Apeiron. I'm about to show that Apeiron was definitely not welcomed with open arms, and that the continuing need to deny the Apeiron led to a whole new cultural movement, namely modernism. Einstein's theory of relativity is commonly interpreted as saying everything is relative, but that could not be further from the truth. In fact, Bertrand Russell claimed that the theory was misnamed since it is anything but relative. Einsteinian relativity became the most celebrated theory in the history of science because it answered the critical challenge of the Michelson-Morley experiment in a way that the conservative world of science could accept. When the old notion of three-dimensional space plus time was subverted by the findings of Michelson and Morley, far from embracing the spaceless and timeless Apeiron, Einstein proposed and worked out in mathematical detail a new and more abstract order of space and time, the four-dimensional space-time continuum. So while the concrete space and time of everyday experience had lost their absolute certainty and could no longer serve as adequate containers for the tempestuous Apeiron, Einsteinian space-time provided a new context in which certainty could be maintained and Apeiron still denied. Similar to the way Einsteinian relativity responded to the challenge of the Michelson-Morley experiment, the other main branch of modern physics responded to the challenge of Max Planck's experiment. I'm referring, of course, to quantum mechanics, the discipline that treats the quantized, discontinuous, uncertain nature of light in a mechanistically continuous way. Again, as with the Michelson-Morley experiment, the discontinuity of light found in Planck's experiment threatened the old idea of spatial continuity and the sense of certainty that went with it. And like relativity theory, quantum theory was designed to circumvent the discontinuity, to do an end run around the Apeiron by imposing a highly abstract version of space, it's called Hilbert space, in which the discontinuity could be managed and contained. So despite the fact that the famous uncertainty principle is the central feature of quantum theory, by no means does quantum mechanics embrace uncertainty any more than Einstein embraced relativity. Instead, the strategy is to constrain and minimize the uncertainty or discontinuity by containing it in Hilbert space. Einsteinian relativity and quantum mechanics are quintessentially modernist. I suggest that modernism was our culture's general way of responding to resurgent Apeiron. With 20th century modernism, the uncertainties that arose in the 19th century were neither simply denied, nor were they genuinely accepted. Instead, they were gotten around by imposing a new order of certainty at a higher level of abstraction. This was clearly evident in modernist art. The field of art evolved in such a way that it didn't merely challenge the classical outlook by introducing more and more ambiguity. In the transition from Manet to the cubism of Braque and Picasso, there was an implicit move toward resolving the uncertainty. I will attempt once again to share an image. Let me see. Oh, I see what's happening, why it's getting messed up. The share button is being obscured when I put the image in. And now you see the image, do you not?
Yeah.
Okay, and that is Picasso's it's Picasso's card player. And I'm gonna stop sharing that and just try one more image and go through my laborious procedure of discovering the share box. And that is Braque's musical forms. Okay, it's a little bit of a learning curve for me, sorry. It wasn't that the images of the cubists were no longer ambiguous, but that in carrying artistic expression to a higher level of abstraction, the artist could now detach him or herself from said ambiguity, thereby establishing a vantage point from which certainty could be reclaimed. Cubism has therefore been described as providing, quote, a God's eye view of reality. And the art critic Ernst Gombrich noted that Cubism was, quote, the most radical attempt to stamp out ambiguity and to enforce one reading of the picture. I realized, by the way, that Gebser was more amenable to Picasso than I seem to be. Since the modernist response to the resurgence of Apeiron cuts across our whole culture, it involves many disciplines and dimensions of life, not just physics and art. Additional examples can be found in cinema, literary theory, psychology, philosophy, and so forth. I deal with this in Dimensions of Apeiron, and John Dotson's concept of synesthesia is relevant here. For now, I'd like to pose the question of how successful modernism has actually been in containing the Apeiron. Einstein, in fact, authored two theories of relativity. 10 years after the 1905 publication of his special theory of relativity, the general theory was unveiled. In the latter approach, the gravitational force was now taken into account. How was this done? Both theories employ the four-dimensional space-time continuum. In the general theory, gravitation is represented by the curvature of space-time. The greater the force of gravity, the more the continuum is curved. Space-time is taken as totally flat in the special theory. Now, while Einstein found it necessary to adopt this approach, he soon realized that it had its limitations. If the gravitational mass of a body were great enough, the curvature of space-time would become so extreme that a tear would be produced in the continuum. What this meant is that analytic continuity would be lost and the theory would simply fail. However, for that to happen, the mass density of the gravitational body would certainly have to be enormous. When the general theory was first presented in 1915, the existence of such astrophysical bodies was purely hypothetical. But as the 20th century wore on, the possibility of stellar objects whose masses were sufficient to produce black holes in space began to be taken more seriously. This led some physicists to raise explicit doubts about Einstein's theory. Could it survive its prediction of gravitational collapse? By the end of the 20th century, empirical evidence for black holes had only grown stronger, and now it seems irrefutable. Summing up the course of development of Einstein's two theories, the first was essentially an attempt to avoid the discontinuity implicit in the Michelson-Morley findings, which had brought up serious questions about classical space and time. Einstein would plug the gap in three-dimensional space by postulating a four-dimensional space-time continuum. In generalizing this new account to gravitation, he assumed the curvature of space-time. What we're seeing, in effect, is that the four-dimensional method used to compensate for the absence of continuity in three-dimensional space winds up reintroducing discontinuity, black holes in space. So it seems that the moment curved space was applied to generalize Einstein's remedy for discontinuity, a new order of discontinuity was prefigured. To put it more bluntly, Einstein's solution didn't work. At bottom, it did not effectively address the mid-19th century crisis brought on by the resurfacing of Apeiron. Nor does quantum theory ultimately work. In its recent attempts to explain the whole of nature through its theory of everything, it's had to descend to smaller and smaller levels of magnification, and this has made it harder and harder to manage the uncertainty at its core. In the final analysis, the uncertainty proves to be completely unmanageable. Physicist Lee Smolin wrote about this in his book, The Trouble with Physics, and I've written about it at length in The Self-Evolving Cosmos. In the broadest cultural terms, I suggest that modernism doesn't really work. While this approach does initially seem to resolve Apeiron's ambiguity, it is ambiguity that prevails in the end. Modernism deconstructs itself. It collapses into postmodernism. The same pattern is evident in the field of art. Following the devastation of the Second World War, the postmodern deconstruction of modernist art began to take shape. We see it particularly in Jasper Johns and Andy Warhol's irreverent send-up of high art by celebrating the banalities of popular culture. After the rise of pop art, a diverse assortment of other strategies and styles began to proliferate, the absurdist happenings of performance art, the sometimes apocalyptic emotionality of neo-expressionism, and so on. As the art world has unraveled into a pluralistic hodgepodge of divergent approaches, the only threads of unity that have remained appear to be negative ones. The continuing emphasis on uncertainty, fragmentation, and eccentric absurdity. The agreement that art can never be fully defined. The effort by art to call into question its own existence. The crux of the difference between the now prevalent postmodern art and its modernist predecessor is this. Whereas modernist art sought unitary meaning beneath the surface play of ambiguities, for postmodernism, there is only that surface. In short, postmodern art intimates the collapse of rational order into the chaos of Apeiron. It is not so much that Apeiron is recognized and acknowledged as such, as the boundless irrational force of primal nature. Rather, postmodernism is essentially a negative enterprise. It negates modernism without offering any viable alternative. As a result, modernism, instead of being surpassed, lingers on in its own wreckage. Behind the addictively obsessive quality of postmodern art, exemplified by the endless repetition of a single image in the works of Andy Warhol and others, lies the inability to end the modernist quest for abstract unity, even though it's now obvious that that quest has failed. So the contemporary art world confronts its own black hole. With the illusion of modernism shattered, the genie is out of the bottle and there's just no way of getting it back in. Like it or not, Apeiron is here in earnest and must be honestly faced, not sidestepped or finessed as in modernist efforts. But how can we face the unfaceable without being blown away by it? While some might say that postmodernism does face up to the Apeiron, to me that's clearly not the case. In 21st century culture at large, the one-sidedly negative effects of postmodernism have metastasized in various devastating ways. All we've seen with this is an unwitting, regressive descent into chaos, wherein long-held values, standards of behavior, and codes of decency have disintegrated. And all the while, the doomsday clock inches closer to midnight. As a matter of fact, in the meteorological counterpart of this fall into chaos, the negative face of the still repressed Apeiron seems literally expressed. It appears in the consequences of the climate change that we've hastened by our postmodern cynicism and greed. One way the climate crisis shows itself is in the form of dramatically increased vortical activity, hurricanes, tornadoes, and the like. And according to Anaximander, the Apeiron creates and perhaps destroys the world by means of the vortex. So when you see an image of a hurricane, like the one I'm going to attempt to put up, let's see, share and image and share, and there it is, an image like this. I'm wondering whether when we look at this, we're seeing a literal expression of the Apeiron, though I have to admit this may be a bit too fanciful. So in negating the positivity of modernist, we shouldn't confuse such a negation with honestly confronting Apeiron. There's a subtle dialectic at play here that needs to be teased out. From the viewpoint of the modernist ego, who, governed by Aristotelian logic, can only think in terms of sharply bounded positives and negatives, Apeiron is certainly a negation. But Apeiron itself is not Aristotelian. The ambiguity that it embodies is neither negative nor is it positive. It's simply ambiguous. It seems that ambiguity or paradox is much harder for us to accept than mere negation. So when we see our modernist efforts slipping into paradox, rather than staying with the paradox, engaging with it understandingly and in a concrete way, we tend to choose negation, the postmodern option. In this way, the pure positivity of modernism is replaced by pure negativity. What the modernist and postmodernist have in common is their penchant for purity, whether positive or negative. Neither can bring themselves to face the impure, hybrid, Medusa-like quality of Apeiron. But then there's Jung and Gebser. I certainly don't think of them as postmodern, but neither are they really modernist. I believe that each in his own way was receptive to paradox, and on an ontological level that can be taken as implicating the Apeiron. The embrace of paradox is in fact what Jungian individuation, that whole journey, is all about. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung notes that, quote, things have gone rapidly downhill since the Age of Enlightenment. For once this petty reasoning mind, which cannot endure any paradoxes, is awakened, no sermon on earth can keep it down. A new task then arises, to increase the number of persons who have at least some inkling of the scope of paradoxical truth, end quote. And in Mysterium Conjunctionis, Jung says that, quote, paradox is the natural medium for expressing transconscious or psychoid facts. It's in Mysterium that Jung draws from alchemy to lay out the basic stages of individuation as processes of paradoxical conjunction, each one a union of opposites, a coincidentia oppositorum. Each conjunction involves moving against the grain of narrowly rational ego consciousness with its categorical distinctions and dualities, its paradoxophobia. Each involves withdrawing the projection of these dualities and moving backward into the unconscious, ultimately to the prima materia, the original chaos and the sea. In other words, returning consciously to that long repressed primal force, the Apeiron. Jung's lifelong work with dreams and active imagination was part of this backward movement into the unconscious. And I think that this is just the kind of movement we need today, given that the continuing repression of the Apeiron is a critical factor in pushing humanity close to the edge of the cliff. What about Gebser? Writing about paradox in a section of the ever-present origin, Gebser actually wasn't as affirmative as Jung on the importance of paradox, since he was concerned that paradoxical thinking could get trapped in mental conceptualization. Yet, at the same time, he apparently believed that paradoxical thinking does show some promise in moving us toward integral consciousness. In fact, he went so far as to associate the transition to integral consciousness with the transformation of left into right and right into left that is characteristic of paradoxical cognition. Among the examples he gives of the left-right shift are the 20th century rise of the political left, the emergence of feminism, and the advent of psychoanalysis, which sought to bring the unconscious, in other words, the left, to conscious awareness. On the question of the Apeiron's role in Gebser's approach, Rod Hemsel, a proponent of Sri Aurobindo, claims that, quote, Gebser gets his idea of the ever-present origin from this concept of the Apeiron, end quote. But actually, when I examined Gebser's magnum opus, I couldn't find any direct evidence of that. On the other hand, as I indicated earlier, Gebser's original structure of consciousness, the archaic, is undifferentiated, utterly without boundaries, and therefore, by definition, it is Apeiron. We can say in general that the overall trajectories of Jungian individuation and Gebserian integral consciousness unfold in parallel, ultimately arcing back to the boundless beginning. Jung did speak of the need to withdraw the projections of rationalism and follow them consciously back to their origin in the unconscious, back to the original chaos of the prima materia. Gebser similarly spoke of the need to retract the projections of mental rational consciousness and allow the older, hitherto overshadowed structures, mythic, magic, archaic, to shine through. This would bring awareness of a diaphanous structure that includes primal boundlessness. So it seems that at bottom, Gebser and Jung were both determined to recover wholeness, and without simply relinquishing what the rational ego has accomplished through the distinctions it has drawn. Jung and Gebser were seeking to fuse disparate structures of consciousness without confusing them. And still the doomsday clock is ticking. Perhaps what's needed at this critical moment is a different way of experiencing time. After all, isn't the chronological time of the mental ego, with its dualities and fragmenting divisions, isn't it this that has played a central role in bringing us close to midnight? Integral consciousness would bring what Gebser called time freedom. The question then is this: can I free myself from the domination of an order of time that fragments my consciousness into a disjointed leaping from one point-like moment to another? Can I be free to once again experience through the diaphaneity of consciousness an order of time that is mythic, a slower, more soulful order of time? Can I go further into the depths of the moment and come to full awareness of the timeless time of the archaic, of the origin, of the Apeiron? To me, this is the great challenge of integral consciousness. It's the challenge that faces us at this singular moment in planetary history. I'm going to end with Jung's darkly prophetic, famous comment from 1957 that resonates so strongly today. This will be familiar to you. Quote, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. Nowadays, we're not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing in nature as an H-bomb. That is all man's doing. We are the great danger. The psyche is the great danger." Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Questions? Well, I have one. You noted when you were describing modernity or the modern.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay. I'll bend down this way so you can.
Hi.
So you noted when you were describing the modern or modernity, the concept of certainty, to be certain.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could say a little more about how we tend to need and desire certainty and how uncomfortable we are with uncertainty and how that relates to the situation that we're in today.
Thanks, Jeff, and it's good to finally meet you.
Good to meet you.
Well, I mean, the way I look at it, looking at it historically, what I'm saying is there's the long view of history that I could talk about that I think I've already touched on, and the short view. In the long view, Western culture has always struggled with the uncertainty of the Apeiron. Erich Neumann has interesting things to say about how with the rise of patriarchy, which corresponds to the rise of Western culture, we were attempting to nail things down and no longer have to deal with the uncertainties of the maternal order. And so for 2,500 years, we've been repressing uncertainty, which is embodied, according to my own reading, embodied in the Apeiron. We've been repressing it. We've been successful at it, apparently. There's been science and math and technology. And finally, we reach a breaking point where certainty can no longer hold up. Our whole identity is bound up in certainty. It's a threat. It's an existential threat. Our identity is so fixed, the ego identity, that our very lives feel threatened if that certainty is compromised in any way. It's a fixed view, it's a static view, and we have trouble dealing with anything more ephemeral. That's the long view. A shorter view is the late 60s and early 1970s, the counterculture, which posed its own challenge to certainty, and the backlash against that. We've been seeing that backlash ever since. All of the fundamentalisms that have arisen, which are quite distinct in my view from the old form of older forms of religion. All of these fundamentalisms are ways of attempting to ward off uncertainty. And finally, we have Trump. And this is the ultimate breakdown of certainty and people's desperation to recapture that certainty at any cost. And to my way of seeing it, that's the tension we're viewing today in the socio-political world. The desperate clinging to certainty in the face of its demise, as exemplified by Trump and his ilk. That's the best I could do, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great answer. Right? Any other questions? Jeremy.
Thank you, Steve. Hi. Yeah, I guess maybe a good question would be, in terms of uncertainty and ambiguity, what are some efficient or positive expressions you would see in human culture of that? We have a lot of ancient and archaic ones, right? You mentioned for the last 2,500 years, we've been growing more and more into this battle against uncertainty, but what would you see as potential seeds of a future culture that was much more comfortable with uncertainty?
Yeah. Well, I think historically, we've gone from an effective, efficient quasi-certainty. I mean, with the advent of science and technology over the last several hundred years, this has been, the differentiation that has come out of that has been positive. But then there was a tipping point when greater certainty was no longer so efficient and could no longer be accommodated. I think what we need now is an integration of certainty and uncertainty. I think the attempt to revert to certainty, which is what modernism tried to do, the attempt to revert to certainty has proven unfruitful, and it's just not going to happen. So I think we have to learn to live with ambiguity, not sheer, pure ambiguity, as in postmodernism, but a balancing and integration of ambiguity and clarity. I won't even say certainty, because I don't think there is any absolute certainty. I think that's an old classical and modernist ideal. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you. We're going to move to the next speaker. Steve, it was great to see you and hear your presentation. We wish you well. Thanks so much for participating.
Good luck with the rest of your conference.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.